Hello, everyone, and welcome to ACS webinars, connecting you with the best and brightest minds in chemistry, live from Washington, D.C. I'm Michael David, and I am pleased to be your host for today's broadcast, which is being co-produced with ACS Professional Education. Many people use high-performance liquid chromatography, yet very few understand how it works. Today, we are joined once again by Dr. Lee Polite, the president and founder of Axion Analytical Labs, and who is also a virtuoso on the HPLC. Lee is here to share how to adjust HPLC parameters for a faster analysis, better separations, and lower detection limits. We would love to get you involved in the discussion, and you can share your thoughts and questions in the questions panel. You can also join the discussion on Twitter by including @Americhem Society in your tweet. The slides for today's webinar can be accessed right now by clicking on the link that you see in the GoToWebinar control panel, and an invitation email to view the unedited recording of today's presentation will be sent to all registrants after the broadcast. Our moderator for today is Brian Tweedy, a senior manager with ACS Learning and Career Development. In this capacity, he has general management of the organization's professional education and training, as well as career services and leadership development programs. And with that, Brian, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Mike. Our speaker today, Dr. Lee Polite, is the National Instructor of Chromatography for the American Chemical Society, and he has held that position since 1991. He's one of the highest rated instructors in the ACS because he brings chromatography to life. I've had the pleasure of working with Lee for the past 15 years in this capacity. Lee is well known for explaining complex instrumentation and concepts using examples from everyday life. He can teach anyone chromatography, just ask his wife and kids. In 1995, Lee founded the Axion Training Institute with the mission to provide hands-on HPLC and GC training to the world's chromatographers. Since then, Lee has trained over 12,000 professionals, and his goal is to train another 12,000. Every major pharmaceutical, chemical, and petroleum company in the United States has sent their employees to Axion for HPLC or GC training, as well as most of the major government labs. Dr. Polite earned his PhD in chemistry from Virginia Tech University under the direction of Professor Harold McNair, a foremost chromatography professor and a pioneer in the field. Lee serves as Chief Scientific Officer for Sweetwater Energy Corporation, is adjunct professor of chemistry at the Illinois Institute of Technology, and shares his passion for chromatography wherever he can. That is why Dr. Polite is excited to help you learn how to master HPLC method development. And oh yes, and Lee, my question to you as I hand over the microphone, what are all those buttons for?
Okay, thank you, Brian. Thanks for the great introduction. Brian and I have been working together for 15 years, and we have not aged a bit. At least our pictures have not aged a bit. So I am welcome everyone to this seminar. I'm really happy after this crazy year and a half. I'm happy to be alive and happy to be live with you talking about HPLC. We're actually talking live from Chicago, where we have a classroom full of people. This is our first ACS class that we're teaching since the crazy COVID. We've got a room full of, we got some chemistry professors, we got some chemistry high school teachers, my personal heroes. We've got lots of graduate students from Illinois Technology. We have some cannabis aficionados, and even one of them works in the cannabis industry. So we're here talking about HPLC, and to me, this is such a cool topic because HPLC is the #1 tool out there for figuring out what is in stuff. Yet very few people understand how it works. So I'm here to sort of unveil those mysteries to you to get you to understand the HPLC part of it. So when we think about HPLC, we think about our options, and we think about what all those buttons are for. So when you walk up to an HPLC, you have to set the correct mobile phase strength and the correct column length and particle size and temperature and flow rate and detector wavelength, and oh my gosh, there's so many parameters, so many buttons, how can we make sense out of it? But here's the cool thing. In this grand world of HPLC, this most complicated technique, there's only 3 things that are going to affect this separation. So let me take a big step back and say that here we are with the world's most popular separation tool. And we ask the question, what does HPLC do? I mean, we know we analyze things, we know we figure out what's in stuff, but really, what do we do from a technology perspective? So if you peel back the layers, HPLC is really a separation tool. And what it does better than any tool in the world is it separates complex mixtures into pure compounds. So we ask the question, why do we separate? Well, we separate to identify what's in the sample. We separate to quantify. How much is in the sample? We may even separate to purify, to actually purify something from the sample. But step one is always to separate. And unfortunately, when people learn HPLC, that's the step they skip over. They forget about the separation, and then they wonder why it's so complicated. So when I teach HPLC and GC, I try and use a lot of analogies. I find that we sort of work better with analogies. It's called a transferable concept. We understand one thing, let's transfer it to another. So I like using car analogies. And I look at it this way. If you look at a car, if you wanted to understand everything about a car, you would have to have a PhD in physics. You would have to understand adiabatic expansion in the motor. You would have to know torque transfer. You'd have to know gear ratios, coefficient of friction between the rubber and the road. And the bottom line is there's a lot of variables there that most of us don't understand. Yet, most of us know how to drive a car. Well, those 20-somethings out there, they're not learning this much. But the rest of us, we know how to drive a car. Then you know when you get behind the wheel of a car, you press the pedal on the right, and it makes the car go faster. The pedal on the left makes the car go slower. So HPLC and GC are the same way. There's a bunch of buttons and knobs and dials, but each one is there for a reason, and I'm here to teach you what they're for, and I'm not going to skimp on the details. I'm going to give you the underlying technology so you can understand why you're pressing those buttons. So most people expect this to be complicated. They're expecting this to be like, giant, calculus equations, but the reality is there's only 3 things that affect your separation, only 3 parameters. And once I show you what they are, the coolest takeaway is you are in charge of all 3. So if you have a separation you don't like, you can fix it. You can make it faster. You can make separation better. You can improve the sensitivity. It's a matter of turning the right button or knob. It would be like saying you're driving down the highway at 35 miles an hour and you're trying to figure out how to make the car go faster. Well, I have an idea. Let's just push the accelerator. So that's what I hope to get you to, where it's going to be a very natural thing for you to look at a chromatogram and decide what you need to do to fix it. Okay, so here we have an equation. I know that's going to scare a lot of people. So don't get scared by looking at this thing. I'm not going to make you do any math. There's no calculus. We're not going to do any of that kind of stuff. I just want you to look at the equation. I want you to see what parameters are involved. So there's only 3 things involved in resolution. There's only 3 things involved in separation. Let me show you what they are. So as I go down here, I'll start off with a really cool concept. And that is when we take a look at this separation, we know that we need good resolution. We need a good separation. We have a definition of what that means. A resolution of greater than 1.5 is the universally accepted number as good baseline resolution. So that's a really important concept. We are doing chromatography. We are scientists. And if you look at a separation and you're going to judge the quality, we might say, oh, separation is pretty good, sort of good, really good, very good. Those are not scientific terms. We're scientists. We put numbers on things, right? So let's put a number on it. 1.5 is the definition of baseline resolution. So now the question is, how do we get there? I want to get to 1.5, but how do I push the buttons to get me there? So the first thing we always look at is the capacity factor. So capacity factor, what we're going to relate to this in just a little bit. This is going to be how to set your solvent strength. This is going to tell you what percentage of methanol, what percentage of acetonitrile to use, and it's all about hitting this sweet spot of chromatography. And capacity factor sweet spot is between 1 and 5. So if you have really low capacity factor, you get lousy separations. If you have 1 to 5 capacity factor, we're getting good separations. So we need to get into that range. What we're really doing is we're weakening the mobile phase enough to allow the analytes to spend time in the stationary phase. Okay, think about this. When we're doing HPLC, the sample's traveling through the column. It has a choice. It can stick to the stationary phase or the mobile phase. So we want to make the mobile phase weak enough to encourage the molecules to spend time in the stationary phase, because that's where the separation occurs. So all you math geeks out there, if you really want to see the equation, okay, there it is. That's how we calculate capacity factor. But here's how I describe capacity factor. It really says, how long has this compound been on the column relative to the mobile phase? So T0 is how long it takes the mobile phase to travel through your column. So if anything comes off at T0, it means it hasn't separated. It hasn't spent any time in the stationary phase. So our goal, our job as chromatographers, is to set the mobile phase weak enough to get this capacity factor in that 1 to 5 range. Okay, let's jump to the bottom line. So if you don't like math, here's the answer. If you want to improve the capacity factor, you simply need to weaken your mobile phase. Well, what does that mean? Most of us are doing reverse phase. 80% of all the columns sold are reverse phase columns. So let's assume we're doing a reverse phase. And if you're doing reverse phase, making the mobile phase weaker means adding more water. Increase the percentage of water, and I guarantee you will improve your capacity factor. In fact, I give a rule of thumb, not meant to be an exact number, but if you add 10% more water, that's an absolute 10. So go from 40% water to 50% water, you will roughly double your capacity factors. That's 100% improvement in the most important term in chromatography, and that costs you nothing. I'm sure those instrument companies out there would love to charge you for that. I always joke they'd love to put a coin box on the top of your LC and say, oh, you got to put a quarter in anytime. If you're going to add more water, that's going to improve your separation. You got to pay for it. Well, this is free. All you do is add more water to the mobile phase, and that will improve capacity factor, which will improve your separation. Now, let me remind you, our goal is to get between 1 and 5. If your capacity factor is already 10, I could teach you how to make it 20, but there's no advantage to that. So this is great news. This means you don't have to wait forever for good chromatography. A lot of people think the longer you wait, the better it gets. That's only true up to a point. When you get to a capacity factor of 5, there's very little to gain beyond that. So once we get to that point, let's leave the mobile phase there and look at the other terms. So the first term, capacity factor, tells us simply, am I using the right mobile phase? Is it too strong or too weak, or is it the right stuff? So what we're doing here is we're really talking about coming up with a recipe for HPLC. Now, another analogy I like is a cooking analogy. So I'll admit I'm not a very good cook. I mean, I know how to boil water. I know how to measure things with measuring cups. I'm pretty good at that analytical chemistry stuff. But I have no idea how someone comes up with a recipe. Like the recipe for a cake. I mean, I could follow it off the back of the box, but how do I know who figured out how much flour, how much sugar, how many eggs, and then the order of operation? Do I heat the flour first in the oven, and then do I mix in the eggs? Or do I mix them first? Do I put in the oven for 600 degrees for 2 minutes, or 6 hours at 50 degrees? So the way I look at it is, who came up with all those parameters? I think most people look at HPLC the same way. Who figured out the right column length and particle size and mobile phase strength? And well, this is where it comes from. I'm showing you how to develop your own recipe. So no matter what the sample is, you run it on the column. If the peaks are coming off too early, if they're coming off in that void, near the void volume, and the separation's bad, you have a really simple solution. Add some water to the mobile phase, 10% water, you will see those capacity factors double. You will see a huge improvement in your separation, in your resolution. Okay, so that's the capacity factor. That tells us solvent strength. So the next term is what we call selectivity. Selectivity is the chemistry of the separation. So this is where the theoreticians have lots of fun. We could spend years talking about selectivity and not quite figure out all the possibilities. But let me put it this way. We have a rule, we have a number, and that's selectivity of greater than 1.2. So that's our goal. We need at least 1.2 of selectivity in order to get a separation. So selectivity, yeah, the equation's easy. That one's easy. But understanding selectivity, I'll admit, this one's dumb. This one's tough. This is a difficult one. But let me remind you of something. This is the function of the mobile phase, the stationary phase, the pH, the temperature, the buffer, the additive, all kinds of stuff. But here's the thing I like to remind people. 80%, 85% of us will choose reverse phase as our mode of HPLC. That to me means reverse phase must have the correct selectivity for 85% of all the problems. So something to do with C18 and methanol water or C18 and acetonitrile water seems to be able to separate most things. So I just play the probability game. If you're doing HPLC, you're probably going to end up in the reverse phase mode because it gives us the right selectivity for most compounds. It seems to work well for most. So that's why I start with that. So I'm going to leave that alone. I'll give you a little more information in a slide or two, but for the most part, selectivity, I'm just going to say go reverse phase, buy a good C18 column, try acetonitrile water, methanol water. That's probably going to work. And then the final thing we'll talk about is called the efficiency. Efficiency is the skinniness of the peak. So it measures how skinny the peak is. Our goal is to get skinny peaks. The skinnier the peak, the better the separation. Also, the faster the analysis. also the better the sensitivity. So this becomes sort of a no-brainer. Our goal is to make the peak skinnier. The skinnier the peak, everything gets better. So we have this term called efficiency, and I just call it the peak skinniness. I could show you the equation. There's a couple of different ones out there. So that's how we calculate efficiency. But more importantly, let's talk about how we improve efficiency. So right now, let me give you an example. I get one of my customers calling me up, and actually I got a former student, Garrett's hanging out. Hey there, Garrett. He just texted me and said, hey, I'm on the line. He took my class a couple of years ago, and so let's say I get a call from a student from 2 years ago, and they say, hey, Lee, I'm working on this really tough separation, and I cannot separate my two peaks. Tell me what to do. So first thing I'm going to ask 3 questions. The first question is, what is your capacity factor? Because I need to know if you're using the right mobile phase strength. So let's say the person comes back and they say, hey, I got a capacity factor of 3. Well, that's fantastic. You've got the right mobile phase strength. Whatever the percentages of methanol right now, that is the exact right percentage. Lock it in. Next question, what's your selectivity? They come back and they say, I've got 1.4. 1.4, that's fantastic. You have the correct stationary phase. You got the right mobile phase. You are in luck. We're going to fix this. I guarantee it's going to work. If you have selectivity, I guarantee we're going to get a separation. So final question, what's your efficiency? And let's say they come back and they say, my efficiency is 1,000 plates. 1,000? That's a little embarrassing, isn't it? That's a really low number. But here's good news. I promise we can get more efficiency. But the trick here is you're going to have to spend a little money on this one. You got to buy a new column. Your column is terrible. How do I know that? Well, you just told me you got 1,000 plates. That's sort of not a very good column. Average efficiency out there, this is a moving average, this is a moving number, moving target, but I used to say 5,000 plates. A lot of people have 5,000 plate columns, and so now we're edging it up a little bit, but average out there is 5,000 to 10,000. Maximum you get in HPLC based on today's off-the-shelf technology is about 30,000. So when someone calls me up and they say, hey, Lee, I got 1,000 plates, I'm like, okay, we could do better than that. This is what you need to do. So you could use a longer column. If you double the length of the column, you will double the efficiency. Efficiency is proportional column length. So we could use a longer column, or you could use smaller particles. If you cut the particle size in half, you will double your efficiency. That, by the way, is the approach we like to take, because if you use a longer column, your analysis time will be longer. Double the column length, double efficiency, but you double the analysis time. If I cut the particle size in half, I don't affect the analysis time at all, but I improve the efficiency. So we love smaller particles. And then I'm going to say to optimize the flow rate. It turns out that there's one flow rate in HPLC that gives you the best efficiency, the skinniest peaks. That is based on what we call the Van Deemter equation. And so you could, some people call it the Nike swoosh, which is offensive to us. But so if you look at the Van Deemter equation, it will tell you that there's a minimum flow rate. A flow rate that gives us an optimum efficiency. So the optimum flow rate, I'll give you a ballpark number. If you're using a standard HPLC diameter column, 4.6 millimeter ID, that's what most people use. The optimal flow rate for that column is right around 1 mil a minute. Now, it depends a little bit on the particle size. The smaller the particle, the higher that optimum is. But if you're right around 1.2 mils a minute, you're sort of pretty close to the optimum flow rate for a standard diameter column. If you're using a 2.1 millimeter column, you got to do the math. Divide it by 5, and so you're at about 0.2 mils a minute is optimal flow rate if you're running a 2.1 millimeter ID column. Okay, and then the last thing we say is minimize extra column volume. Sort of a mouthful. What that says is we want to minimize the volume outside of your column. So you have a column, it's got high efficiency, it's a beautiful thing, you paid $500 for it, but every piece of fitting, every piece of tubing that you use will decrease your efficiency. So my approach is let's minimize how much we're going to give away. Let's minimize the amount of tubing, the length of tubing, the diameter of the tubing, the number of fittings between the injector and the detector. Think about if the sample touches it, it's an important component. So from the injector to the column, from the column to the detector, those are your critical pieces. We want to minimize the volume, minimize the length. We don't want our molecules broadening out in all that extra tubing. So I have just presented to you the entire story of resolution. I didn't dumb it down. I didn't leave anything out. And I believe this is really important. I am not a theoretician. I'm a practical working chromatographer. I have about 23 chromatographs in my lab that I work with every day. And I look at this as the most practical thing in the world, because this tells me what is the right mobile phase strength, what is the right stationary phase chemistry, and what is the right column dimensions for me to get the separation. So this is the recipe on how to bake the cake. And this is how you come up with your own recipe. So you can inject your own sample and use this same equation. So, okay, I hate to do equations. I hate to do this to you guys in the afternoon. So let's see if people are still awake. So Mike, why don't you give them a survey question?
All right, our first survey question for all of you is, and you can click directly on one of those radio buttons you see in front of you to answer. It is, the definition of a good resolution should be greater than or equal to 0.5, 0.7, 1, 1.5, or any of these values. And I can see some results coming in now, but I'm going to keep this open a little while longer. Also, reminder to everyone, we are eager to get your questions for the Q&A, so no need to wait until the end of Lee's presentation to ask. Feel free to enter a question in whenever it comes to your mind. And with that, I'm going to close this poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And Lee, this is somewhat of a runaway. 83% said 1.5, 11% said 1, and none of the rest really got that high. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Awesome. So people, not only are they awake, but they're actually listening and learning. Okay, that's fantastic. That alone, to me, is like worth the price of admission. Okay, I guess you didn't pay anything for the course, but it's worth the price of admission because you now have a mathematical definition that tells you whether or not you can trust your results. Are your results valid? Can you believe the results? You got a 1.5 resolution? I believe your results. You got less than 1.5? I don't believe your results. Go back and fix it. So that is an incredible statement. If you know that, you now know how to judge chromatography. Fantastic. Okay, so let's keep going. Sure enough, there's our 1.5. That's where our goal is. I know, what is it, 11% of the people out there said 1.0. They're probably computer jocks. Computer jocks, if you do enough playing around with algorithms, they can try and drop baselines. But for the most part, we love this 1.5 or greater because we know we can trust the results. Okay, so let's talk about, now that we have this equation, we won't call it an equation, now we know our parameters, let me show you how we go about developing a method. And this is going to be, this is very timely because the folks sitting here in the room, we're doing a hands-on class, we're a 5-day class, and they're about to go into lab, and I'm about to hand them a total unknown. They may not know this yet, but they're going to be judged on this unknown. I'm going to send them into lab, and it's going to be based on whether or not they can do the separation. So here's how we look at it. The first question I ask is efficiency. So if you're doing method development, let's say I'm starting from scratch, I have a brand new sample, I have no idea how to run it. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a really high efficiency column. So let me tell you the philosophy here. If I start with the highest efficiency column possible, if I get that 20,000, that 30,000 plate column, I no longer have this as a variable. In other words, I have 3 variables right now I need to optimize: capacity, selectivity, efficiency. But if I start with the highest efficiency possible, then I don't have to worry about that anymore. It is no longer one of my concerns. So let me tell you a little trick. I'm going to start with what I call a long column, a 15 centimeter, 3.5 micron. There's about 20,000, 22,000 plates, or a 10 centimeter, 1.8 micron. We're going to get our roughly 30,000 plates. I'm going to start with this column, but I hope at the end of method development, my next step is method optimization. I hope I look at that and say, I have so much resolution, I don't need all 15 centimeters of this column. I only need 5 centimeters of it. That's where I hope we get to. But the problem is, if we start with the 5 centimeter column, we go all the way through method development, and it doesn't work, then we're going to say, gee, I wonder if the 15 centimeter would have worked. So we start with the 15 centimeter. We start with the long one. It's got more than enough plates. And then at the end, we'll be able to tell, hey, you know what? I only need 1/3 of the plates. I don't need such a long column. So start with a long column, small particles, lots of efficiency. And that is our starting point. So the next thing we're going to look at is the selectivity. Now, remember, I already said this is tough. I mean, if you talk to any professor, any theoretician, boy, they could go on for days talking about selectivity. But here's the way I look at it. We know that reverse phase seems to work for most applications. So I come to this conclusion that choose reverse phase whenever possible. If you look at column sales, if you just visit people, and I fortunately get to talk to lots of customers every year. It's about 80–85% of every HPLC chromatograph out there is done in the reverse phase mode. And the columns last a really long time. So that to be says, it must work for 80–85% of the problems. So that means acetonitrile or methanol blended with water on a good C18 column, I'll emphasize that, on a good C18 column solves most people's HPLC problems. So I'm going to cop out a little bit here and say, yeah, just trust me on this one. Just go reverse phase. And this is one of my favorite cartoons. This is Sidney Harris, a wonderful cartoonist. And in this, you look at this professor and he says, I think you need to be more explicit in step 2. So my step 2, my miracle is, yeah, reverse phase is miraculous. It just does work for both separations. Okay, as a scientist, I can't get away with that, right? So I got to give you a little bit of background why reverse phase seems to work for everything. Reverse phase is sometimes called hydrophobic interaction, or the mechanism behind it is hydrophobic interaction. We're separating based on hydrophobicity, based on polarity. So the bottom line is, if you have 2 molecules you're trying to separate, if they have any differences at all, then we can separate them by reverse phase. So if these 2 molecules differ by the number of carbon atoms, we have an extra methyl group. Well, that's like I could drive a truck between those peaks. So one extra methyl group greatly changes hydrophobicity, which means we separate peaks. If you have one molecule as a hydroxyl group, the other one does not. That's a huge change. The hydrophobicity will separate them beautifully. You put an amino group on the end, you put a cyano group on the end, you put an acid group on the end. Anything you do to change a molecule, you're pretty much changing its hydrophobicity, which means we have the ability to differentiate it by HPLC, by reverse phase. So that is my shorthand wave on why we prefer reverse phase, because the mechanism, I call this generic. It's a generic mechanism that tells very minor differences between molecules, and that's the name of the game when we're doing HPLC. So easy answer, choose reverse phase. And then I go into a little more detail. Look, reverse phase is the best choice for neutrals, polars, and nonpolars with molecular weights less than 2,000. It is the best choice for homologous series. That would be like methanol, ethanol, propanol, butanol. It is the best choice for organic acids, organic bases, proteins, and peptides. When you look at that list, you realize that's pretty much everything. That is why reverse phase dominates. It is the primary approach to most applications. Now, I won't think that this is not a panacea. This is not perfect. It doesn't do everything. So things that are a little more challenging, very polar and very nonpolar. Now we have tricks. We can do those too by reverse phase, but we got to pay a little special attention to polar things and very polar, very nonpolar things. Okay, so let's see if you guys are sort of on board with me. Let's see if Mike, why don't you see if they're still awake and see if they've understood something about reverse phase.
All right, so our second question for everyone is, why do we usually choose reverse phase? Is it A, the mechanism seems to work for most separations? B, it allows us to analyze polar and nonpolar compounds? C, the solvents are less hazardous than normal phase? D, to impress my friends at the next cocktail party? Or finally, the last option, all of the above? And I'm seeing the results come in now, and am going to be closing this poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And Lee, it looks like 62% of the audience clicked the first option. The mechanism seems to work for most separations. Next up at 25% was the second. It allows us to analyze polar and nonpolar compounds. And then 11% said all of the above. The other two didn't really get that much. So I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Okay, thanks, Mike. Great answers. You know, it's hard for me to argue against any of those. I look at this, my answer is all the above, because the mechanism seems to work for most separations. Whoever said that, you guys are totally right. I totally agree with you. It also allows us to analyze polars and nonpolars at the same time. The solvents are less hazardous than normal phase. Normal phase, you got hexane, it's a neurotoxin, it dries out my skin, it gives me a headache. So solvents are less hazardous, and okay, who would not be impressed at the next cocktail party if you described your reverse phase mechanism? Okay, I guess that part is part of the joke. So I like the fact, I like your answers. I'm with you on the mechanism seems to work for most separations. And if you like my humor, I'd go with all the above. Okay, so the final thing to talk about is the capacity factor. And this is that solvent strength. So a lot of people walk up to me and they say, okay, I got this unknown. What's the right solvent strength? What what mobile phase or what percentage methanol should I use? And my answer, I have no idea. It's an unknown. None of us know. In fact, we're all going to run a sample this afternoon here in Chicago, and none of us know the answer to it. So how are we going to find the perfect mobile phase strength of that total unknown? I have an idea. Let's try every mobile phase strength, every single strength known to man. What does that mean? We are going to do a gradient. We are going to start with a very weak mobile phase, 10% methanol, 90% water, and we're going to program up to a very strong mobile phase, 100% methanol or 100% acetonitrile. So we're going to start with 10% methanol or acetonitrile. We're going to program up to 100% methanol acetonitrile. And after one run, you're going to tell me what the right answer is. So, so let me give you an example. Let's start with a definition. This is isocratic elution. Isocratic elution means constant solvent composition. We're going to use the same mobile phase all day long. In this example, I'm running 50-50 water methanol. So notice that the first couple of peaks are too close together. The last couple of peaks are too far apart. I always say isocratic is a compromise. If it works for you, it's fantastic, but we sort of give all the molecules one mobile phase and we say deal with it. Well, those poor molecules up front, I mean, look at those 3 peaks up front are crammed in the void volume. They're sort of saying, they're telling us, you know, 50-50 methanol, 50% methanol, that's too strong for me. Look at that guy way out there at the end. He's like at 40 minutes. He's like, you know, 50% methanol is too weak for me. I'll come off eventually, but you better be patient. So we've compromised with 50-50 methanol water. But now I want you to take a look at just the first 3 peaks. Forget about those last couple, just the first 3, the things that are jammed up together. I want you to look at them, and we all agree that's terrible resolution. I want you to help me fix this. So based on what you've learned so far about chromatography, let's talk about the mobile phase strength at that part of the run. We have peaks that are coming off too early, they're crammed together. They must be very polar, they're early eluters. So it really sort of comes to the next question, that is, I have first couple of peaks, they're coming off together near the void volume, they have a very low capacity factor. So the question becomes, what should we do to the mobile phase in order to improve the separation? So Mike, let's do one more poll with these guys. All right. What do you think I should do? What should we do to the mobile phase in order to improve the separation? Or what should we do to make the separation better? I'll read the options. The first one, make the mobile phase stronger. Do we want that? Do we want a stronger mobile phase and pull things off faster? Do we want to make the mobile phase weaker, add more water to get more separation, get better separation up front? Do we want to slow down the flow rate? Or do we want to just change the detector length? So go ahead and open that one up, Mike, and see what people think.
All right, so it's been open for a little while now, and a good share has already responded. So I'm going to close this poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And Lee, this one also a runaway. 81% said make the mobile phase weaker, 10% said make it stronger, and 9% said slow down the flow rate. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, awesome answers. Yes, make the mobile phase weaker. That is the absolute right answer. That is the big tool in HPLC. We get more bang for the buck with the solvent strength than we will for anything else. If your solvent is too strong, you're gonna get lousy separation. The way I put it is, you could buy the world's best HPLC, buy the world's best column, and if your mobile phase is too strong, you're gonna get a terrible separation. That's good news. I know it didn't sound like good news, but to me that says, oh, I could change this parameter and I could make things better. So in almost every instance, we want to look at the beginning of the chromatogram and we want to weaken the mobile phase to get better separations. Excellent. Okay, so now let's talk about the definition of a gradient. A gradient means, let's start with a weak mobile phase, 10% organic. Let's go to a strong mobile phase, 100% organic. The reason we don't like to go below 10% because C18s will collapse if you get down to less than 5% really. So this is just sort of a general rule. I like to start minimum 10%. I'll push it to 5, but I like minimum 10%. So when we do a gradient, we give each peak its own favorite mobile phase. So instead of saying, today we're running 50-50, deal with it, I get to say, okay, I'm running 10% methanol. And what happens is that first peak says, yeah, I like 10%. I'm good with that. All those other peaks, they're stuck to the column. They're laughing at us. They're like, I'm not even gonna budge. 10%, I am frozen solid on this column. I'm gonna sit here forever. Then you get up to 20%. And that second peak says, oh, 20%. Yeah, you know, I'm soluble. I like that. I'm out of here. The other guys, they're still stuck to the column. Then we get to 30% and 40%. So you get the idea that each peak gets to leave the column when his favorite mobile phase comes by, when his solubility number is hit. So this is great. This is a way to do complex samples. We get good resolution in the beginning, the middle, the end. We get better detection limits because peaks are skinnier. We get rid of all the nasty things that will absorb on the column because we're washing the column. So this is a great approach. A lot of us will use this as a scouting run in method development, and that's what I'm about to show you. So here's really the question: how do we figure out the right mobile phase? So here's 3 rules for setting the gradient. First rule: initial composition must be weak enough to give the first peak a capacity factor of at least 1. Okay, think about that. It should make sense. If the first peak is at least 1, all the other peaks will be greater than 1. So let's set the initial condition for the first peak. Don't worry about any other peak in the chromatogram. None of them matter. Only the first peak matters for your initial condition. So just focus on 1 peak. Make it a capacity factor of 1. Next thing, the final composition must be strong enough to get the last peak off the column. You can't leave it there. You got to get it off the column. So the first peak tells you the initial condition. The last peak tells you the final condition. It's not a mystery. When a molecule comes off at 82.5% methanol, he's telling you, I love 82.5% methanol. There's no mystery behind that. So the final thing that we set with gradients is the gradient steepness. You can call this the gradient time or the slope. So here's the deal. The longer the gradient, more shallow it is, the higher the resolution, but it takes longer. So the more we stretch out the gradient, the better the separation gets. It's sort of like a rubber band. We could stretch it, we could improve the separation dramatically by stretching out the gradient. I always say maximum 30 minutes. You know, you could talk a lot about a theory and where that comes from, but 30-minute gradient is about as good as it gets. Going longer than that is sort of a diminishing returns. Okay, so let's jump to the good stuff. These are gradient slopes. So if you look at the first one, 5-minute gradient, those peaks are squeezed together. If you look at the last one, a 40-minute gradient, those peaks are stretched apart. So this is a powerful tool that we have. We could simply stretch the chromatogram and improve that resolution just by stretching out that gradient. Okay, so let's put it to the test. Here's an unknown. This, by the way, is where my students will be living in a few minutes. This is the total unknown. We've injected it. We've done 10 to 100% B in 15 minutes. By the way, that recipe is a recipe I've used for every method development project I've done for the last 25 years. 10 to 100% in 15 minutes, and then simply see what the sample tells you. Listen to your sample. It'll tell you the right answer. So we look at this sample, and you guys tell me, should I start, is there any reason for me to start this run at 10%? No, why not? There's nothing coming off there. You're wasting time. Where would you start this run? Well, you're looking at a chromatogram, you're saying, yeah, it looks like that peak's not coming off to like 80%. Okay, let's start this at 80%. So initial condition for the next run, we're gonna start at 80%. Why is that? I'll take a look at those peaks. Nothing's coming off early. Next question, do we need to go to 100%? Yeah, pretty much. What is that, 98, 99% for that last peak? Call it 100%, make your life simple. So we know we need to start at 80. We know we need to go to 100. So all you have to decide is how much time you're willing to wait to go from 80 to 100. Okay, does that one make sense? So for the next run, we're gonna start the gradient right here. Why right there? It's right before the first peak. No mystery to that. That's what peak's telling us. Okay, new sample. Sample number 2, total unknown. We're expecting 5 peaks, I'll tell you that. And very first run, 10 to 100%, and that's what we get. So first question, do I need to start this sample at 10%? Yeah, absolutely. Look at that first peak. We need 10% to hold it on the column. Do I need to go up to 100%? No, you're wasting time. How high do you need to go? Take a look at the chromatogram. You only need to go to 35%, right? Everything's off by then. So you're going to do a gradient from 10 to 35%. Boom, you're done. Make sense? Believe it or not, it's really that simple. Okay, stop the gradient right there. You're done. How about a tougher one? Sample number 3. We do a gradient, 10 to 100%. We get this. Ooh, it's beautiful, right? A lot of people say, I'm done. Method's done. It's a beautiful separation. It is a beautiful separation, but this is what we call too much resolution. I mean, you can do this if you only run one sample a day, fine, but we can save a lot of time by squeezing these together. So do we need to start at 10%? Yep. Do we need to go to 100%? Yep. Do we need to wait 15 minutes? No. So we're going to do this in 5 minutes, and what that's going to do is going to squeeze those peaks together. Too much empty space, use a gradient, faster gradient to squeeze them together. Okay, last one, total unknown. We do this as a gradient, 10 to 100%, and all 5 peaks come off, boom, right in the middle. Do not let that intimidate you. It's the same problem. Ask the same questions. Do we not need to start at 10? No, we're going to start this guy at 50. Do we need to go to 100? No, we're going to stop it at 60. So we're going to go from 50 to 60, but we're going to slow down that gradient to stretch it out. That works great. Or we can simply use Isocratic. So this is a good example of where we're doing a gradient to do method development, and at the end of it, we look at it and we say, hey, all my peaks seem to like the same mobile phase. If they like the same mobile phase, give them the same mobile phase. If all the peaks come off under Isocratic conditions, you are ahead of the game. You will get the best resolution. That's the flattest gradient you can get, right? That's a gradient of 0. So you can look at each of these and you can decide how to fix it. So this is any sample you get, 10 to 100% in 15 minutes. Take a look at the separation and then decide what to do next. So this is what we're going to be doing here next in our hands-on class. This is an original method. It's a 20-minute run. The method down below, I shouldn't show this to folks, but that is someone who did a really, really good job of this and did the separation in 30 seconds. By the way, this is not UPLC. We do UPLC here as well, but I sort of make sure these are just regular instruments, 3.5 micron particles. And this is what you can do if you just learn the basics of HPLC. You can take 20-minute methods and get them down to, well, I won't promise you get all of your methods down less than a minute, but it's pretty impressive what you can do with just understanding these simple parameters. Okay, with that said, we're gonna open up the floor for questions here in a minute. A big thank you for you guys just for hanging out and listening. I'm happy to say that we're a training facility. We train people in chromatography. We say beginner to expert in 1 week. I have 16 people here in the room who can pretty much attest to that you go beginning to expert in 1 week. We do this for the ACS. If you want to know about our classes, please go to our website, axionlabs.com/ACS, or if you have a question to ask, same place, axionlabs.com/ACS, and we're happy to answer questions. This is what we do for a living. We're chromatographers. We give answers away for free. And I'll make one last statement, and that is thank you to all the scientists for getting us out of that COVID mess. I mean, oh my gosh, talking about a moonshot. We in less than a year, the scientists out there figure out a way to make mRNA and figure out a way to make vaccines, and we couldn't have done it with a bunch of accountants. We couldn't have done it with a bunch of lawyers. We did it with a bunch of scientists. So thank you guys, for all of you guys out there for doing that. I'm always happy to help and do my part. So I believe at this point, I will hand it back over to my buddy Brian to tell us more about cool ACS stuff. But let me remind you, send me questions. I love answering. This is what we do. My whole group, we answer chromatography questions, axionlabs.com/ACS. So Brian, over to you.
Thanks, Lee, for a very wonderful, informative session. So before we begin the Q&A, I have to make a couple of announcements. So first, if you enjoyed today's webinar, which I'm sure you did, Lee teaches at LCGC Bootcamp, the hands-on chromatography masterclass. This course will teach you everything you need to know about operating HPLCs and or GCs, develop methods, and troubleshoot. During the course, you will disassemble, assemble, and experiment with dozens of these instruments in our laboratory. The course includes time for breaks, networking, and other energy boosting activities. And by the end of the course, you will know more about chromatography than 85% of the professionals who do it for a living. So our second announcement is ACS now provides much of our online on-demand courses training by subscription packages. With a subscription, you can learn, your team can access a wide range of coursework anytime and anywhere, removing the need for travel and scheduling. A variety of offerings and packages are available. To schedule a consultation, use the online scheduling tool at meetme.so/ACS Parade Conversation. That link has been placed in the chat. So now on to the Q&A. So first, Lee, we have a few questions around your massive resolution equation, so we'll start there. So Eric asked, what do the T and the W stand for in that equation?
Excellent. I love practical questions like that, especially ones that I can answer. So yeah, I apologize for tossing that equation at you. So T, little t, it's usually T sub r is retention time. Little t sub 0 is the not retention time. So T sub 0 is it's the amount of time that the mobile phase takes to travel through the column. So it's a good measuring point because we want to make sure that all of our analytes spend more time on the column than the mobile phase. So if the mobile phase takes 1 minute to come out, we want to make sure that all of our peaks come off well past a minute and essentially double that. So that's how we calculate capacity factor. And then W is peak width. So you know, the chromatographers out there, we've had a couple of different equations over the years, but W sub 1/2 or W sub H is the width at half height. So this gets a little into the theoretical part of stuff, but when we look at a peak, we assume peaks are Gaussian shaped. And then when we want to measure the efficiency, we can measure the peak width at base. We can measure peak width at half height. There's different, what they're called is different moments of the peak, and it has to do with statistics. So my easy answer, W sub H is width at half height, or W sub 1/2 is also width at half height. So those are the good practical question. Thanks for that one.
Great. So Nafisa asked, and this is maybe too mathematical. So what is the theoretical equation for optimal flow rate, if there is one?
Oh, yeah. Is someone actually asking me to tell them about theory? I love that person. Thank you, person, whoever you are. Okay. So yes, the optimum flow rate comes from the Van Deemter equation. Van Deemter, great guy, 1956. JJ Van Deemter is doing his stuff. What's funny is we all know this is the Van Deemter equation. He was a very quiet person, did not want to be known for this. So he wanted his partners to get it, but their names are really difficult to pronounce. So it's Van Deemter, von Klinkenberg, and Zaderbech. It's a Dutch name that I can't pronounce. So anyways, it's a Van Deemter equation. Send me an email or let me know, and I'm happy to give you more information about it. But it's the plot that we typically see, which is the linear velocity versus h. So what it tells is what flow rate gives us the best efficiency. It is a function of particle size. So the smaller the particle, slightly higher optimum flow rate, and also what we call a flatter Van Deemter, the ability to go to higher flow rates without giving things away. So it's called the Van Deemter equation, and thank you for asking that. It's Van Deemter did this in 1956. He, as far as I know, never saw an HPLC in his life, and every equation he made is still applicable today to HPLC. So the guy had something going on. Great question, thanks.
So a general question on our selectivity. So David asks, how does the pH, the temperature, and the buffer affect the selectivity of a column?
Oh man, that's a good one. Selectivity questions. Oh my gosh. Okay, so selectivity is the chemistry of the separation. So I think about on the molecular level, how does your molecule, how does your analyte interact with the stationary phase? Is it hydrogen bonding? Is it pi electrons, dipole interaction? So this could get real ugly real fast, but I look at it as, so selectivity is a chemistry. Now, pH will only affect selectivity for acids and bases. It will have absolutely no effect on neutrals. So if you're doing benzene, toluene, xylene, they do not care about the pH because they only have one form. If, however, we're doing benzoic acid, it could exist in two forms. Benzoic acid is neutral, well retained. Benzoate is ionized, and it comes off close to the void volume. So pH will move acids and bases around. It will not move neutrals. I've actually used that as a tool in advanced method development. You imagine you have 20 peaks. I could selectively move any acid in one direction, any base in the other direction, as much as I want, simply by playing with the pH. So pH could be very powerful if you have acids, bases. Most of us sort of take the easy way out and say, I never want my ionization to change. So typically we will run at just very low, pH of 2 for things. So that's where the pH affects things. The temperature. Oh man, how's the temperature affect selectivity? If you figure that one out, please call me and tell me, because I've been doing this my whole life. High temperature HPLC, I've mentioned to my group here. I think it's a great place for some research. My easy answer is I don't think temperature has much of an effect on selectivity for most compounds. Usually, a higher temperature is a stronger solvent, and usually all peaks move in and out together with temperature. Higher temperature, they move in. Lower temperature, they move out, but sometimes you'll have one peak that'll move in or out at a faster rate. There's one example, that's funny, in my advanced class I have an example of that. It's called cytochrome C. And what's funny is that's my example. It's also everyone else's example in the whole world of HPLC. So I look at that and I say, if we're all using the same example, there must not be a whole lot of examples. So easy answer. Those are secondary effects of selectivity. So pH only for acids and bases, and temperature. I personally rarely see it affect selectivity, but the big textbooks will always say, you know, look to selectivity if you're doing advanced method development. My opinion, don't expect much. I rarely see it change, but it's easy enough to change temperature to see if there's an effect. So great question.
Great. So two questions around peaks. The first question, Sarma Peter asks, how do you prevent tailing and peak broadening in your runs?
Ooh, yeah, boy, that's a great one. Okay, peak tailing. That is the peak shape that we fight against all the time in HPLC. So if you have a tailing peak, there's two very different things that cause tailing. One is acid-base interaction. So HPLC columns are based on silica. Silica has some acidic sites on it called silanols. Basic compounds will stick to those sites. And anytime you have adsorption, I call that like Velcro. It's easy to stick and hard to pull apart. So if you have a basic compound and your column has acidic sites on it, you will get tailing peaks. If it's the acidic sites that are causing the problem, it will not cause a neutral compound to tail. So here's a quick way to check. If you inject a neutral like toluene, it should not tail because it's not an acid or a base. So first statement, if you have acid-base problem that I just mentioned, you need to buy a good base deactivated column. Every column company in the world makes their base deactivated columns. We call them NCAP columns, sterically protected columns. They're very low acidity columns. It is, in my opinion, that is the column that all of us should be using. Whether you're working acids, bases, neutrals, my opinion, we all should start with a good base deactivated column. That takes away tailing due to acid base. Now, the other thing that causes tailing is empty space in the column, empty space in the flow path. If you have a void in the column or a bad fitting, that causes all the peaks to tails. Every single peak will get broad and tailing if you have empty space and bad fitting. So how do we tell the difference? Inject a neutral. Toluene can never tail. If it does tail, it must be a bad fitting. If toluene does not tail, but your compound X tails, your compound X must be an acid or base. In that case, I would suggest buy a better column or buy a new base deactivated column from any major manufacturer. That is the way to go. So another set of good questions.
All right, so here's a three-part question all about actually using reverse phase and how well should it use for certain actual analytes. So the first question is, does a reverse phase work for analyzing the presence of fat or water-soluble vitamins?
Okay, so fat and water-soluble vitamins. So we're looking at a very wide variety of polarity, right? So we got water-soluble stuff, we got fat-soluble stuff. So my first statement, yes, reverse phase is the way to go because we could do both polars and nonpolars. But let's talk. So the nonpolar stuff, that's easy. It's the polar stuff that we're going to worry about because the molecules, when they get really, really polar, we cannot retain them. And if we cannot retain them, then we're not going to get a good separation. So for the polar compounds, first thing is let's go down to a low percentage of methanol, go down to 10%. Or, by the way, when I say methanol, you can exchange acetonitrile for that in every statement I've made. They're, I won't say interchangeable, but you choose one or the other. Okay, so we start with 10% methanol or 10% acetonitrile to see how that looks. If we still cannot retain it, there's a special type of column out there that I love that are called polar embedded phases. All the names sound like water: aqua, aquasil, hydro, hydroselect, AQ. So anytime you see that, this is what I call a modified C18. It's a sort of a C18 column, but they put a polar group either in the chain of the C18 or down as the end caps. And what that allows you to do is it allows you to run a reverse phase column all the way down to 100% water, 0%. So we've done this. We do acetic acid in fermentation broths. We could literally run 100% water all day, and the column works great. So I am personally a big fan of polar embedded phases. For the water solubles. You can still do the fat solubles on that same column. The other answer to the water soluble, the very polar things, is HPLC, hydrophilic interaction chromatography. I will leave that alone because it's a completely different topic. And I don't know, a nice way to say in the next 2 seconds that I've not been impressed by HPLC yet. So I'll leave it at that. Part 2.
Okay, the part 2 is around pesticides. Will reverse phase applicable to in the case of pesticide analysis?
Oh, okay, pesticides. So pesticides are usually done by GC. The EPA methods, most EPA methods are GC methods, electron capture detector, mass spec. But there are a couple of pesticides that you cannot heat up. You can't vaporize, they decompose. So those we have to do by HPLC because HPLC doesn't use heat. At this point, I'm going to plead a little ignorance, and my gut says I'd probably go to a reverse phase column, but I'll tell you how I'm going to cheat and answer this question. I open up a column catalog and I'll flip through it to look for pesticides, and I'm going to see what's Agilent doing, what's Phenomics doing, what's Shimatsu doing. So I would just look that one up. There is an EPA method for carbamates. You could download that for free. Go to epa.gov. All their methods are free, and you could download that one to see what they're using. But my gut says it's going to be a reverse phase column.
Great. So Mio asked, you mentioned UHPLC briefly earlier, and her question is, does HPLC method development also apply to UHPLC?
Yes, I'm giggling here, and so is everyone in the room because they sort of heard me on my rant earlier today. So here, I don't know how to say this clearly enough, but UPLC is HPLC. If I look at the history of HPLC, in the olden days, we had 20 micron particles. Those are called chorosil, horribly old-fashioned. Then we went to 10 micron. That's where I grew up. I started HPLC in 1980, 10 micron particles. And then we went to 5 micron particles, and we called it HPLC. And then we went to 3.5, we called it HPLC. We went to 3.0, we called it HPLC. Then suddenly, when we went to 1.8 micron, we started calling it UPLC. So so my statement is UPLC is HPLC. I see no difference. There is no difference in the world between the two. UPLC, I don't even think we have great definitions for it because we call UPLC, UHPLC, STM, RRHT. There's all kinds of different acronyms out there, but it's all the same thing. What's HPLC? From the beginning of time, we've said use smaller particles in order to get higher efficiency. That's what Van Dinter said in 1956. So, sorry that I'm on my soapbox here, but my feeling is UPLC, HPLC, it's the same thing. Technically, we'd say UPLC are sub 2 micron particles. Maybe that's the definition, and maybe it's higher pressures. But the bottom line is every single thing I've talked about is HPLC, UPLC, because it's the same thing. The smaller the particle, the higher the efficiency, the faster the analysis. So if you could afford a high pressure instrument with these really small particles, fantastic. I taught these guys a little trick. I do UPLC on my oldest instruments. I have these old 1100s. They only go to 400 bar, but I run UPLC columns on them all the time. My trick, I crank up the temperature to 60 degrees, and these guys work great. So I'll get off my soapbox and say, yes, everything I've said completely applies to UPLC as it does to HPLC, and I will leave it at that.
Great. So it looks like we have time for one more question, and it's another peak question here. So Angela asks, how do you troubleshoot the late injection peaks?
Yeah, I'm scratching my head a little bit because I don't entirely understand the question. So I'm thinking, we make an injection. Do we have peaks that come off very, very late? Those are very non-polar. We need to go at a very high percentage of 100% methanol, 100% acetonitrile. We need to let it sit under those conditions in order to make sure those peaks come off the column. So I always joke, you can't leave the peak on the column, right? It doesn't, just because you're done with chromatography doesn't mean it's done. So you have to go to a high enough percentage to wash every peak off the column. Otherwise, it's going to come off sometime in the middle of one of your other samples. So that's one of those things that we want to make sure that we get everything off the column.
Yeah, I think you're right. That was the intent of the question. So,
yeah.
So again, thank you for your presentation today, Lee. And there's one lesson you want the listeners to learn from today. What would that be?
You know, to me, I look at this and say, this is doable. You could completely understand HPLC. I know professors trying to make it more difficult, trying to make it difficult, but you are in charge of the only 3 things that can affect your separation. Once you realize that, you are now in charge of your separation. You can make it faster, you can make it better, you can make the sensitivity better, you can do all those. You now have the knowledge to go forth and do that. So go forth and do good things.
Thanks.
Well,
With
Lee,
that, I'll pass it over to Mike.
thanks so much, Brian. And Lee, thank you so much for joining us today to share all that wonderful information. If you enjoyed today's broadcast, we invite you to join us for more free upcoming webinars. Next week on June 23rd, we will be joined by a panel of industry experts who will share how to navigate the chemical industry. They will share some steps you can take to advance your career, what skills and traits industry executives are looking for in a successful job candidate, and much more. On Friday, June 25th, we will be joined by the 2016 Nobel laureate in chemistry, Sir Fraser Stoddart of Northwestern University, who will discuss his award-winning research regarding artificial molecular machines, as well as his current research regarding the molecular pumps and motors, working away from equilibrium on surfaces, as well as in solution, and this is all part of our Frontier Friday series. Finally, on June 30th, a team of policy experts from the ACS Government Affairs team will discuss the current policy environment in Washington, D.C., progress that is being made in STEM issues and on ACS priorities, and what might happen in the coming months, including as well as all of that, they're also going to share how you can get involved. We would love to hear what you think about our program. You can reach out to us through the ACS social media channels on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, or by email at acswebinars@acs.org. We are curious to hear what you thought of today's broadcast, and a short survey will pop up directly after the webinar that will take just a minute to complete. Also, remember that an invitation email to view the recording from today's presentation will be sent to all registrants for a 24-hour period, after which it will be removed, edited, and posted to the ACS Webinars library. And that wraps us up for today. On behalf of all of us here at the American Chemical Society, thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon.